June 1950. The Korean Peninsula is about to become the battlefield of one of the most brutal conflicts of the early Cold War. At first, the war seems almost impossible for South Korea to survive. Thousands of North Korean soldiers pour across the 38th parallel. And at the front of that invasion comes a weapon South Korean forces are almost completely unprepared to stop. The Soviet-built T-34-85. Fast, heavily armored, armed with an 85mm cannon. And, in the opening weeks of the Korean War, terrifyingly effective. South Korean troops often have little more than small arms, machine guns, mortars, and outdated anti-tank weapons. The result is devastating. North Korean tanks punch through defensive positions. They roll across roads. They crush barricades. They scatter infantry. And they keep moving. For weeks, the T-34 becomes a symbol of North Korean battlefield superiority. But then something changes. American forces begin arriving in strength. And among the weapons sent into the fight is an upgraded American tank that had already earned a reputation during World War II. The M4A3E8 Sherman. The EZ-8. It isn't the newest tank on the battlefield. It isn't the heaviest. And it certainly isn't invincible. But it has something the early South Korean defenders desperately lacked. Training. A powerful 76mm gun. Improved suspension. Better fire control. And crews who know how to fight armored warfare. Then comes a remarkable series of encounters. American Shermans begin hunting North Korean T-34s. And in one of the most dramatic armored episodes of the Korean War, EZ-8 crews claim dozens of enemy tanks destroyed. One account would eventually credit American Sherman crews with 41 North Korean tanks destroyed. But this wasn't simply a story about one tank being better than another. It was a story about technology, terrain, training, logistics, air power, and the brutal reality of modern warfare. Because the T-34 that had terrified South Korea in June 1950 was about to discover something very different from the scattered resistance it had faced during the invasion. It was about to face America, the tank that started the Korean War. When people think about the Korean War, they often picture mountains, freezing winters, trenches, and infantry fighting across steep hills. But the war began very differently. It began with movement. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel. The invasion was backed by the Soviet Union and supported by a large military force built around Soviet equipment. At the heart of the North Korean armored formations was the T-34. The T-34 had been one of the most famous tanks of World War II. It had fought German armies on the Eastern Front. It had combined sloped armor with mobility. And the later T-34-85 carried an 85mm gun that gave it substantially greater firepower than the early war T-34-76. By 1950, these tanks were no longer revolutionary. But in Korea, they were fighting an opponent that was dangerously underprepared for them. The South Korean army had no meaningful tank force of its own. That fact would become critical almost immediately. The South Koreans had infantry. They had artillery. They had small numbers of anti-tank weapons. But they did not have the kind of armored formations necessary to meet a major tank offensive head-on. So when North Korean T-34s appeared, many South Korean soldiers had few realistic options. The psychological effect was enormous. Imagine being an infantryman on a road outside Seoul. You hear engines. Then you see smoke. Then the silhouette appears. A tank. Its armor is angled. Its turret rotates. Its cannon points toward your position. And you know your rifle cannot stop it. That is the nightmare created by armored warfare. A tank doesn't have to kill everyone in front of it. It only has to convince enough people that resistance is hopeless. And in the first weeks of the Korean War, the T-34 repeatedly achieved exactly that. Seoul falls. The North Korean advance was brutally fast. South Korean forces attempted to establish defensive positions, but the initial invasion created chaos. Units were scattered. Communications were unreliable. Roads became clogged with refugees and retreating troops. And North Korean armor kept advancing. The South Korean capital, Seoul, fell within days. For American policymakers, the situation was shocking. This wasn't a distant colonial conflict. This was a direct test of the post-World War II international order. President Harry Truman's administration feared that allowing South Korea to collapse could encourage further communist expansion elsewhere. American forces stationed in Japan were ordered toward Korea. The United Nations supported intervention. And suddenly, the United States was sending troops into a war that had barely existed in the American public consciousness days earlier. But the first American units arriving in Korea were not prepared for what they encountered. They were moving into a war against a determined enemy supported by tanks, artillery, and Soviet equipment. And the first American soldiers would learn the same lesson South Koreans had already learned. The T-34 was dangerous. Task Force Smith. One of the most famous early engagements was the Battle of Ozan. A small American force known as Task Force Smith was ordered forward to slow the North Korean advance. The Americans had infantry. They had machine guns. They had mortars. And they had a handful of 75mm recoilless rifles intended to deal with enemy armor. But the force was small, and the soldiers had little experience fighting a large armored formation. When the North Korean column appeared, American troops opened fire. For a moment, it seemed possible that the tanks might be stopped. Then the T-34s kept coming. American anti-tank weapons struggled against their frontal armor. The North Korean tanks moved through the American defensive positions. Behind them came infantry. The Americans eventually withdrew. The Battle of Ozan became an early warning. The United States had entered the war. But simply putting American soldiers on Korean soil wasn't enough. They needed heavier weapons. They needed tanks. They needed artillery. And they needed time. The American Sherman returns to war. The M4 Sherman had already fought across North Africa, Italy, France, Germany, and the Pacific during World War II. But the Sherman of Korea wasn't necessarily the same machine American soldiers had driven in 1943. The M4A3E8 represented one of the most significant late-war improvements. The name EZ-8 came from the E8 designation. Its major visual feature was the horizontal volute spring suspension, often associated with the improved HVSS system. The wider tracks helped spread the tank's weight over the ground. That mattered enormously in difficult terrain. But the most important improvement for fighting enemy armor was the 76mm gun. The weapon gave the Sherman substantially better anti-tank capability than the earlier 75mm gun. The EZ-8 also benefited from improvements developed through years of wartime experience. Better suspension, improved mobility, better crew arrangements, improved ammunition, and, critically, crews who had inherited the lessons of World War II. Still, there was a problem. The T-34-85 was also a capable machine. Its 85mm gun was powerful. Its armor was sloped. And North Korean crews had already demonstrated that they could exploit the confusion of the early war. So the question wasn't simply, could a Sherman destroy a T-34? The answer was yes. The real question was, could American tank crews find them? And could they hit them before the T-34s hit back? Korea wasn't Europe. The Korean battlefield was radically different from the open plains of Eastern Europe. Korea was dominated by mountains. Roads were narrow. Valleys could become natural corridors. Rain could transform dirt into mud. Bridges were often critical, and many areas offered limited room for large armored formations to maneuver. This changed how tanks were used. A tank could be extremely powerful on a road, but the same road could also become a trap. A destroyed bridge could stop an armored column. A narrow mountain pass could turn a formation into a long, vulnerable line. And infantry could hide among hills and villages. For American tank commanders, this meant that technology alone couldn't guarantee victory. They needed reconnaissance. They needed infantry cooperation. They needed artillery. And increasingly they needed air support. The Korean War would become a combined arms conflict. Tanks were powerful. But tanks operating alone could become targets. The T-34's early advantage. During the first phase of the war, the North Korean T-34s had a major advantage. They were concentrated. They were experienced relative to many of their opponents. And they were operating as part of a planned invasion. Their crews knew the mission. Move south. Break defensive positions. Keep advancing. The South Korean army had little armored capability to counter them. American units arriving piecemeal could also be overwhelmed. The psychological effect was perhaps as important as the physical destruction. Every tank that broke through a defensive line created another wave of panic. Infantry could retreat. Roadblocks could collapse. Units could become separated. And suddenly the battlefield moved south again. But the North Korean armored force had limitations. Its tanks required fuel. They required ammunition. They required spare parts. They needed bridges and roads. And most importantly, they couldn't replace losses indefinitely. As the war continued, American and United Nations forces began attacking North Korean supply lines. Air power became increasingly important. The strategic situation changed. And the T-34's greatest advantage began to disappear. The Pusan perimeter. By August 1950, United Nations forces had been pushed into the southeastern corner of Korea. The Pusan perimeter. For the North Koreans, this was the moment to finish the job. If they could destroy the United Nations position around Pusan, South Korea might collapse completely. The fighting became desperate. American soldiers defended hills and roads under intense pressure. Artillery fired continuously. Aircraft attacked North Korean positions. And tanks became crucial mobile firepower. The Americans weren't simply trying to destroy enemy tanks. They were trying to prevent breakthroughs. A tank platoon positioned behind an infantry line could respond to a North Korean armored attack. Shermans could move between threatened sectors. They could fire high-explosive ammunition against infantry. They could engage enemy tanks. They could provide mobile protection. And as American armored units gained experience, the balance began changing. The T-34 was still dangerous. But now it was meeting an army with increasingly effective combined arms. The EZ-8 arrives. The arrival of more capable American tanks changed the battlefield. The EZ-8 was not a super-heavy tank. It wasn't designed to shrug off every enemy shell, but it was balanced. It had useful armor, good mobility, a 76mm gun, and a suspension system better suited to rough ground. For American crews, the Sherman had another advantage. It was familiar. The American military had spent years developing tactics around the Sherman. Crews understood how to communicate. Commanders understood formations. Mechanics understood the vehicle. Supply units understood its ammunition and parts. That ecosystem mattered. A tank is never just a tank. It is a crew, a maintenance team, fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, recovery vehicles, radio operators, infantry, artillery, aircraft, and commanders. A technically impressive vehicle can fail if the system supporting it collapses. The Americans increasingly had that system. North Korean forces increasingly did not. The first time the T-34 met its match. As American armored units became more heavily involved, encounters between Shermans and T-34s became increasingly one-sided. The 76mm gun could penetrate the T-34-85 under favorable conditions. American crews learned to avoid simply firing at the strongest part of the enemy tank. They looked for vulnerable areas, turret sides, hull sides, rear armor, tracks, and other points where geometry worked in their favor. This was basic armored warfare. The first crew to detect the enemy often had an enormous advantage. The first accurate shot could decide everything. Inside a tank, seconds mattered. A commander spotted movement. He shouted. The gunner traversed the turret. The loader prepared the round. The tank stopped or slowed. The gunner aligned the sights. Then came the order. Fire. The entire engagement might last less than a minute, sometimes much less. The battle for the kill zone. Imagine an American Sherman sitting behind a ridge. Only the turret is visible. The crew hears distant engines. They know North Korean tanks are approaching. The commander scans through his optics. Nothing. Then movement. A T-34 appears between trees. The American crew has a decision. Fire immediately? Wait. Call for another tank? Every choice carries risk. If they fire too early and miss, the enemy knows where they are. If they wait too long, the T-34 may reach a better firing position. The Sherman gunner settles his sight. The tank commander gives the order. The 76mm cannon fires. The explosion tears across the valley. Smoke surrounds the target. For a second, nobody knows what happened. Then the T-34 stops. Its turret doesn't move. The crew knows. One more enemy tank has been knocked out. And somewhere else along the line, another Sherman crew is preparing for the next engagement. Y-41 became a famous number. The figure of 41 destroyed North Korean tanks became associated with the performance of American Sherman units during the Korean War. Numbers from wartime records can be complicated. Tank kills were not always easy to verify. A vehicle could be disabled rather than permanently destroyed. Another unit might later recover it. Air attacks could make attribution difficult, and battlefield reports could differ from post-war assessments. So historians have to be careful with exact kill totals. But the broader story is clear. American Sherman crews became increasingly successful against North Korean armor. The T-34 was no longer the unstoppable weapon it had seemed to be in June. And that change tells us something important. The battlefield had changed. The T-34's greatest enemy wasn't the Sherman. Ironically, the T-34's biggest problem wasn't necessarily the Sherman. It was the changing war. When the invasion began, North Korean armored units could exploit surprise. They could move rapidly. They could overwhelm isolated defenders. But as United Nations forces stabilized the front, those advantages weakened. American aircraft attacked roads and bridges. Supply depots were bombed. Fuel became harder to move. North Korean units suffered losses. And American forces gained numerical and logistical strength. A tank without fuel is a bunker. A tank without ammunition is a target. A tank without spare parts eventually becomes scrap. And a tank crew without infantry support can be vulnerable to soldiers carrying anti-tank weapons. The North Korean armored formations gradually lost the operational freedom they had enjoyed during the invasion. The American Air War. American air power played a massive role in changing the Korean battlefield. Fighter bombers attacked troop concentrations. They struck bridges. They hit supply routes. They targeted artillery. They attacked armored vehicles. The North Koreans increasingly had to move under the threat of aircraft. For a tank commander, that creates another problem. You aren't just watching the ridge ahead. You're watching the sky. You don't know when aircraft might arrive. You don't know whether your column has been spotted. And if your supply trucks are destroyed behind you, your tanks may soon become immobilized. The Korean War demonstrated a lesson that had already been learned during World War II. Modern warfare is about systems. A tank battle doesn't happen in isolation. It happens inside a network of logistics, intelligence, communications, artillery, aircraft, infantry, and transportation. The side that controls that network can turn a battlefield advantage into a strategic advantage. The Sherman wasn't invincible, but the EZ-8 should not be turned into a myth. It was still a medium tank. Its armor had limits. Its gun had limits. And a T-34-85 could absolutely destroy a Sherman. An American crew that exposed itself carelessly could pay for the mistake with its lives. The 85mm gun was dangerous. The T-34's sloped armor remained effective, and terrain could give either side an advantage. This wasn't a video game where one tank had a higher rating than another. Real tank warfare was brutally unpredictable. A Sherman could win. A T-34 could win. The decisive factor might be who saw whom first, who had better positioning, who had infantry support, who had artillery, who had air cover, who had better communications, and sometimes simply who fired first. The men inside the steel. The most important part of any tank was the crew. 5 men could operate an American Sherman: the commander, the gunner, the loader, the driver, and the assistant driver or bow gunner. Each had a job. And in combat, those jobs became life or death responsibilities. The commander had to observe the battlefield. The gunner had to aim. The loader had to keep ammunition moving. The driver had to position the tank. The bow gunner helped operate the machine gun and observe the front. A well-trained crew could operate almost like a single organism. The commander saw something. The gunner already understood. The loader had the round ready. The driver positioned the hull. Seconds disappeared. Then the cannon fired. North Korean tank crews faced the same reality. Inside a T-34, men were performing the same terrifying calculations. Where is the enemy? Can we see him? Can he see us? Is the gun loaded? Do we fire? Do we move? Every engagement was a contest between human beings inside machines. The psychology of tank warfare. Tank warfare creates a strange psychological environment. You are surrounded by steel. You may feel protected, but you know that another tank's cannon can destroy you. The noise is overwhelming. The engine vibrates through the hull. The cannon blast shakes your entire body. Smoke fills the air. Communication happens through radios, intercoms, hand signals, and shouted commands. Visibility is limited. A commander might see only a fraction of the battlefield. A gunner may be looking through a narrow sight. A driver may have almost no idea what is happening beyond his immediate field of view. And then comes the moment when a shape appears. Enemy. Range. Direction. Fire. There is no time for fear. Fear comes afterward. The road to Incheon. While American forces defended the Pusan perimeter, General Douglas MacArthur planned a bold counterstroke. The Incheon landing. On September 15, 1950, United Nations forces landed at Incheon. The operation threatened North Korean lines of communication. Suddenly, the North Korean army was under pressure from 2 directions. The strategic situation collapsed rapidly. Seoul was recaptured. North Korean forces retreated. And the army that had once seemed unstoppable was now trying to escape. 4 American tank units. This created a completely different battlefield. Instead of desperately stopping an invasion, they were moving north. The T-34s that survived the earlier battles were increasingly being abandoned or destroyed. Some were knocked out by tanks. Some by aircraft. Some by artillery. Some simply ran out of fuel. The great North Korean armored offensive was effectively broken. The T-34s become the hunted. This was the reversal. In June, South Korean soldiers had seen T-34s coming toward them and wondered how they could possibly stop them. Now American and United Nations forces were searching for those same tanks. The hunter had become the hunted. The battlefield was no longer controlled by North Korean armor. The T-34 crews had to retreat. They had to hide. They had to abandon vehicles. And the American Sherman crews had gained something priceless. Confidence. Experience. Knowledge of the enemy. They had learned what the T-34 could do. And perhaps more importantly, what it couldn't do. What the EZ-8 really changed. The EZ-8 didn't single-handedly win the Korean War. That would be an enormous oversimplification. But it represented something important. The United States had taken a proven World War II platform and improved it. The result was a tank capable of fighting the main armored threat it encountered in Korea. The HVSS suspension improved mobility. The 76mm gun provided stronger anti-armor capability. The Sherman remained mechanically practical. And American industry could support it. That last point may have been the most important. America could supply tanks. America could supply ammunition. America could repair tanks. America could replace losses. America could move fuel. America could train crews. And America could support its armored formations with enormous logistical resources. North Korea could not match that industrial system. Why the T-34 was still respected. None of this means the T-34 was a bad tank. Quite the opposite. The T-34 had been one of the most influential tank designs of the Second World War. Its sloped armor was intelligent. Its mobility was useful. Its 85mm gun gave it serious firepower. And in Korea, it proved capable of destroying American tanks when conditions favored it. But the T-34 was now facing an opponent that had learned how to fight it. And that made all the difference. A weapon's effectiveness depends on context. A tank that terrifies an infantry unit without anti-tank support can become much less frightening when faced by trained tank crews with artillery and aircraft overhead. The same machine can look unstoppable one month and obsolete the next. The forgotten tank battles. The Korean War is often remembered for famous battles involving infantry. Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, the Chosin Reservoir, the Pusan Perimeter. But tank crews fought their own war. They moved along narrow roads. They supported infantry attacks. They defended positions. They hunted enemy armor. They fired high-explosive shells into fortified positions. They helped recover damaged vehicles. And they operated in weather that could be brutal. Summer brought mud and heat. Winter brought freezing temperatures. Engines struggled. Metal became painfully cold. Maintenance became harder. Yet the tanks kept moving. Because on the Korean battlefield, mobility could mean survival. The 41 kill legacy. The story of 41 destroyed North Korean tanks became part of the legacy of American armored warfare in Korea. It represented more than a number. It represented a transition. At the beginning of the war, North Korean armor had dominated. American troops were forced to learn quickly. By the later stages of the war, American armored units were much more confident. The T-34-85 remained dangerous. But it was no longer the dominant weapon it had been during the invasion. The American Sherman had survived another war. And once again, it had proven that a vehicle designed years earlier could remain relevant when properly upgraded and properly employed. The difference between a tank and a tank force. This is perhaps the most important lesson from the story. When people compare tanks, they often compare specifications. Armor thickness, gun caliber, speed, weight, range. But wars are not fought by specifications. They are fought by formations. A Sherman crew needs ammunition. A Sherman needs fuel. A Sherman needs mechanics. A Sherman needs radio communication. A Sherman needs recovery support. A Sherman needs infantry. And sometimes it needs artillery or aircraft. The same is true for the T-34. The tank is only one piece. The side that integrates those pieces more effectively can win even when individual machines appear evenly matched. The Korean battlefield after the invasion. By late 1950, the war had transformed again. North Korean forces had been pushed far north. Chinese forces entered the war. United Nations forces retreated. The conflict eventually settled into a grinding struggle, and tanks continued to fight. But the character of armored warfare had changed. The dramatic North Korean armored breakthrough of June 1950 was gone. The war became increasingly dominated by fortified hills, artillery, patrols, ambushes, and positional warfare. Tanks were still valuable, but they were no longer racing across the peninsula in massive armored columns. The Korean War had become something different, a war of attrition. The Sherman's final Korean chapter. The M4 Sherman would remain in Korean service for years. His job changed. It wasn't always hunting T-34s. Often it was supporting infantry. A tank could fire high explosive rounds against bunkers and defensive positions. It could move through difficult terrain. It could provide mobile firepower where artillery wasn't immediately available. The Sherman had evolved from an anti-tank weapon into something broader, a mobile battlefield support system. And that's another reason it remained useful. A tank doesn't have to be the best tank in the world. It has to be useful for the mission. The T-34's final problem. For North Korean armor, the biggest problem was that the battlefield increasingly favored the United Nations. American intelligence improved. Air superiority became overwhelming. Logistics became more difficult for North Korea. American artillery was powerful. and United Nations armored formations became increasingly experienced. The T-34 could still kill, but it had fewer opportunities to operate in the conditions that had made it so effective in June. The armored spearhead had lost its momentum, and without momentum, its strategic value declined. A battle measured in seconds. Consider how quickly a tank engagement could happen. A commander looks through his optics. He sees a shape. 3 seconds. He identifies it. 2 seconds. The gunner rotates the turret. Another second. The loader chambers around. The commander gives the order. Fire. The 76mm shell crosses the battlefield. Impact. The T-34 disappears behind smoke. Perhaps it is destroyed. Perhaps it is disabled. Perhaps the crew escapes. Perhaps the American crew has just exposed itself to another enemy tank. The entire event can happen in less than 10 seconds. And yet the consequences can last for decades. The men who never came home. Every tank destroyed represented human beings. American, North Korean, South Korean, Chinese. Everyone inside those vehicles had a life outside the battlefield. Families, friends, plans, memories. The numbers in military reports can make war feel clean. 41 tanks, 20 tanks, 100 vehicles. But every tank was occupied by men, and every destroyed tank had the potential to become a grave. The Korean War cost hundreds of thousands of military and civilian lives. The armored battles were only one part of that enormous human tragedy. Why the Sherman story matters. The story of the EZ-8 Shermans isn't important because the Sherman was America's most powerful tank. It wasn't. It matters because the story demonstrates how military technology evolves. The Sherman entered World War II as a medium tank designed around mobility, reliability, and mass production. By Korea it had been upgraded. Better suspension, a stronger gun, improved ammunition, better crew experience, and a massive logistical system behind it. The machine had changed, but so had the men using it. The American Army had spent years learning how to conduct armored warfare. That institutional knowledge was just as important as the steel. The myth of the one-on-one tank duel. Hollywood loves the idea of two tanks facing each other across an open field. One fires. The other fires. The better tank wins. Real warfare rarely worked that way. Tanks maneuvered. They used terrain. They relied on infantry. They called artillery. They moved under air cover. They attacked supply lines. They waited in ambush. And sometimes they never saw the enemy tank that destroyed them. A tank battle could be decided before either crew realized the other was there. That is why the American victory over North Korean armor cannot be explained simply by saying, the Sherman was better. The real answer is more complicated. American forces became better at fighting, and the entire military system behind them became stronger. The weapon that couldn't be seen. There was another advantage American forces possessed. Information. A tank crew that knows where the enemy is has a massive advantage. Aircraft could identify movement. Reconnaissance units could report enemy positions. Infantry could identify threats. Radio communication could coordinate formations. The Sherman crew didn't necessarily have to discover the T-34 alone. Information could arrive before the tank did. And once the enemy's position was known, American firepower could be concentrated. This is the essence of combined arms. You don't send one weapon to solve every problem. You combine multiple systems. The final collapse of North Korean armor. The North Korean armored force that had crossed the 38th parallel in June 1950 was effectively shattered during the first months of the war. Some tanks were destroyed. Some were abandoned. Some were captured. Some disappeared during retreats. And replacement became increasingly difficult. The T-34 had gone from spearhead to liability. A vehicle that once symbolized unstoppable momentum now represented a resource North Korean forces could not easily replace. The war continued, but the Great Armored Offensive had ended. The EZ-8's unexpected legacy. The M4 Sherman had been designed during another war, yet it found itself fighting again in Korea. That alone is remarkable. Many military vehicles become obsolete when the next generation arrives. The Sherman survived because it was adaptable. It could be upgraded. It could accept new weapons. Its suspension could be improved. Its ammunition could evolve. And perhaps most importantly, its enormous production numbers meant spare parts and maintenance knowledge were widely available. The EZ-8 wasn't a miracle weapon. It was a mature weapon. And mature weapons can be extremely dangerous when operated by experienced crews. What the T-34 taught America. The early Korean War forced the United States to confront an uncomfortable reality. America's post-World War II military had downsized. The country had emerged from World War II with enormous military power. But only a few years later, the Korean crisis exposed gaps in readiness. American soldiers had to relearn how to fight a major ground war. The T-34 was part of that wake-up call. It demonstrated that America's next war might not look like World War II. It could happen suddenly. It could involve Soviet equipment. It could happen on difficult terrain. And American forces might have to respond immediately. Korea became a laboratory for Cold War warfare. The tank that came back. There is something almost poetic about the Sherman returning to battle. The tank had fought in Europe against Germany. It had crossed North Africa. It had landed in Normandy. It had fought through France. And after World War II, some might have expected its story to be over. Instead, the Sherman found itself in Korea. It was older, but it had evolved. The EZ-8 was proof that old equipment doesn't necessarily mean obsolete equipment. Sometimes the difference between obsolete and effective is a new gun, better suspension, better ammunition, better tactics, and better crews. The price of learning. But the American Army had paid for that knowledge. The first weeks of the Korean War were extremely costly. American soldiers had been thrown into combat against an enemy whose armored strength they had underestimated. The lessons were learned through casualties, through retreats, through destroyed vehicles, through exhausted soldiers, and through commanders trying to stabilize a collapsing front. By the time American armored forces became dominant, the transformation had been purchased at a terrible price. From panic to confidence. In June 1950, the sight of a T-34 could cause panic. Months later, American tank crews were hunting them. That psychological transformation may be more important than the technical specifications. Confidence matters in combat. A crew that believes it can kill the enemy is more likely to hold its position. A crew that believes its weapon is useless may retreat. The EZ-8 gave American crews something they had desperately needed in the opening weeks. A fighting chance. And a fighting chance can change an army. The number 41. 41. A simple number. But behind that number is a complicated story. Tank records are messy. Battlefield claims are often difficult to verify. Some tanks were destroyed by multiple weapons. Some were disabled and later recovered. Some were counted differently by different units. So the exact number should always be treated within historical context. But the larger conclusion doesn't depend on one number. American Sherman units proved capable of defeating North Korean T-34s. The North Korean armored advantage disappeared. And by the time the war entered its later phases, the T-34 was no longer the terrifying spearhead it had been during the invasion. The real winner wasn't the Sherman. If we reduce this story to Sherman versus T-34, we miss the point. The Sherman was only one component. The real American advantage was the entire system. Factories, railroads, ships, fuel, ammunition, aircraft, artillery, infantry, engineers, mechanics, radio networks, training, command, and logistics. The Sherman was the visible part. Behind it stood an enormous industrial machine. That machine could keep producing and supplying modern warfare. And that was something North Korea could not match. When steel meets strategy, the Korean War proved that superior equipment isn't enough. The T-34 had dominated early because it was used effectively against an unprepared opponent. The Sherman became increasingly successful because it was used inside a powerful combined arms system. The lesson is universal. Technology creates possibilities. Training turns possibilities into capability. Logistics keeps capability alive. And strategy determines where that capability is used. The tank that wins the technical comparison isn't always the tank that wins the battle. The final image. Picture the Korean countryside. A narrow road. Mountains rising in the distance. Smoke hanging over the valley. An American Sherman sits beside the road. Its tracks are covered in mud. Its armor is scratched. Its crew is exhausted. The engine is running. Inside, 5 men wait. They don't know what the next hour will bring. Somewhere beyond the ridge is another armored vehicle. A T-34-85. The same type of tank that terrified armies weeks earlier. But this time the battlefield is different. The Americans are ready. The Sherman commander watches the ridge. The gunner waits. The loader has a round prepared. The driver keeps the tank positioned behind cover. Then movement. A silhouette. The commander recognizes it. The turret turns. The gunner finds the target, and the order comes. Fire. The EZ-8 roars. The end of the T-34 Blitz. The North Korean T-34 had begun the Korean War as the spearhead of an invasion. It had crossed the 38th parallel. It had pushed through South Korean defenses. It had helped capture Seoul. It had shocked American soldiers at Ozan. For weeks, it appeared to be almost unstoppable. But wars change. The arrival of American armor. The stabilization of the Pusan perimeter. The growth of United Nations forces. The increasing effectiveness of American air power. The destruction of North Korean logistics. and the improvement of American tactics all changed the equation. The T-34 was still a dangerous tank, but it was no longer fighting the same war. The Sherman that refused to die. The Easy-8 Sherman wasn't the most advanced tank of its generation. It wasn't the heaviest. It wasn't invulnerable, but it was reliable, adaptable, well-supported, and operated by crews who had learned the brutal lessons of modern armored warfare. In Korea, those qualities mattered. The Sherman had survived World War II. Then it survived the opening shock of the Korean War. And eventually, it helped turn the tables on the very tanks that had once seemed unstoppable. The number 41 became part of that story. But the real story is bigger. It is the story of an army adapting faster than its enemy. The lesson from Korea. The Korean War began with a warning. A modern army can be caught unprepared. A tank force can cross a border and change the entire balance of a war. But the war also demonstrated another truth. No weapon remains dominant forever. The T-34 had revolutionized armored warfare in World War II. By 1950 it was still dangerous. But against trained American crews, supported by artillery, aircraft, infantry, and an enormous logistical network, its advantage disappeared. And the Sherman proved that evolution could keep an older machine relevant. Not through magic. Not through invincibility. But through engineering, training, tactics, and industrial power. The men behind the machines. In the end, the story isn't really about steel. It's about people. The American crews who climbed into their Shermans. The South Korean soldiers who faced tanks with almost nothing capable of stopping them. The North Korean crews who drove T-34s south. The mechanics who kept engines running. The loaders who handled ammunition. The commanders who made decisions in seconds. And the infantry who fought alongside the tanks. Every machine was operated by human beings. And every battlefield victory came with a human cost. That is the part of the story numbers cannot fully capture. In June 1950, North Korean T-34s smashed through South Korean defenses and seemed to open a road to total victory. But within months, the battlefield had transformed. American forces had arrived. The Pusan perimeter had held. American armor had grown stronger. Air power had shattered North Korean freedom of movement. And Sherman crews began meeting T-34s on much more equal terms. Then the balance shifted. The tank that had once been the hunter became the hunted. And the Easy-8 Sherman became one of the symbols of America's armored response. The claim of 41 North Korean tanks destroyed is remembered because it captures something larger than a kill count. It captures the moment when the Korean War's armored balance changed. The T-34 had started the war as a terrifying spearhead. The Sherman finished the opening armored chapter as a survivor. And in the brutal mathematics of war, survival itself can become a weapon. The Korean War would continue for years. There would be more battles, more offensives, more retreats, more hills covered in blood, and more tanks. But the great T-34 Blitz of June 1950 was over. The era of easy North Korean armored victories had ended, and the American Easy-8 Sherman had helped make sure of it.